Admiral Krieger was already waiting for them inside of the ship, leaning against the wall, severing the cockpit from the rest of the vessel, with her arms crossed and those ridiculous shades still on her face. As everyone slowly trickled into the passenger space, she pushed to her feet and came towards them with a few quick steps. Something dark yet shiny flashed in her hand as she lifted her arm, holding the item out towards their general direction. Although the shades made it hard to notice, her eyes strangely seemed to be transfixed onto Sheeda. "I forgot to ask earlier," she said without much preamble, slightly wiggling the item with the tips of her fingers in the feline's direction, making lights flash as they bounced off it with each movement. A closer look quickly revealed that it was another pair of shades. "Would you like to go with me today, Sheeda?" Sheeda's ears twitched as she processed the offer, and her yellow eyes widened noticeably as their gaze flashed down to the offered sunglasses. James, of course, felt the urge to be quite skeptical about the offer. However, he very quickly forced himself not to express as much, keeping his face placid and passive while looking at the item in his mother's hands. Just as he had expected, Sheeda's gaze quite quickly flashed up to his face, gauging his expression, and he really didn't want it to seem like he was discouraging her from the decision. Still, some eyebrows were raised around them by almost everyone else as they watched the exchange. After studying James's face for a few seconds, and simply not finding any disapproval in it, or at the very least not enough that it would dissuade her from whatever decision she had naturally come to, Sheeda carefully looked back at the glasses and almost meekly reached out to them. "Is that allowed?" she asked, her fingers coming to a full stop less than an inch away from the shade's reflective surface. Her eyes were locked onto the item, and her ears fully turned towards the Admiral while getting as wide as they could, seemingly not wanting even the slightest chance of missing so much as the most minute detail in her response. The Admiral shrugged. "Sure," she said leisurely, and, in an almost commanding motion, she closed the gap between the glasses and Sheeda's fingers, pushing the item into her hand gently. "You've got your contract, you've got your licenses. If I tell you you can fly my ship, then you can fly my ship." Sheeda's fingers closed around the shades, causing the Admiral to quickly pull her hand away so she could cross her arms again, and she almost challengingly lifted her eyebrows as she regarded Sheeda, who seemed to quietly ponder. Leaving the feline a bit of room to think, she then turned her head and looked over at her commander, who stood so tightly next to James that they were basically shoulder on shoulder. "You don't mind, Coco, right?" she asked, likely implying that it would originally have been the commander's job to play the co-pilot for today. Coco's head immediately tilted to the side, pushing her cheek against James's shoulder while she also put a hand onto his arm, and she cooed, "Ow, not at all." James basically ignored her. He was still looking at Sheeda. After a few more moments of thinking, her gaze met his once again, and she still seemed unsure as she studied his face intensely. But James could quite clearly see the longing slumbering behind her hesitance. A gentle smile came over his lips. "I'll live," he said encouragingly, and nodded towards her in affirmation. "Go for it, treasure." Her eyes got slightly wider again as she listened to him. It wasn't an immediate burst of excitement or an instant, clear resolve for a decision. It was more gradual. An eventual realization that slowly set in over the course of a few seconds, as her gaze slowly loosened from his face and briefly glanced down at the shades again, before finally lifting towards the Admiral. "I'll be happy to, ma'am," she finally said with a firm nod, and life began to return to her movements, as a bit of a smile crept across her face as well. The Admiral smirked and started to turn on the spot. "Wonderful," she said, and opened the door towards the cockpit, going very slightly against protocol by gesturing for Sheeda to enter first, which she immediately did, with her tail excitedly swaying through the air as she moved. "Show me what you can do." The Admiral then gave James a very knowing sideways glance that he recognized, even through the shades, before she too stepped into the cockpit and closed the door behind her. James sighed slightly. "Afraid that she's going to put a flea into her ear?" Coco asked, her head still leaning onto his shoulder, although she now also tried to subtly coax him towards the seats lining the side of the cabin by very gently pushing against his side with her body weight. James inhaled deeply. "If I had to be worried about that," he began to say, but Coco had known him for long enough that she was quick to finish the sentence before he could. "You wouldn't date her, yeah," she droned, with a slightly mocking snicker, clearly proud of herself for still knowing him well enough to read him after such a long time. "I still need to get a better feel for her before I make my judgment on that." James tutted slightly, while finally allowing himself to be pushed towards the seats. Tusk, 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 he said. Sure, as long as you try to get a feeling for her, and not a feeling of her. Even without looking, he could basically feel the malicious grin form on Coco's face, as she glanced up at him from his shoulder. What? You wouldn't be angry with me if I tried, would you, Jamie? She asked, insidiously joking. Although, knowing her quite well, James did pick up on the slightest hint of earnestness behind her words. Don't tell me you've suddenly grown jealous over the last years. As they reached the row of seats, James scoffed as he turned and allowed himself to fall into one of them, letting out a soft oof as he impacted with the hard cushions. Nah, that's completely up to her, he said vaguely, knowing that Coco would get what he was talking about without elaboration. Even without being jealous, he did have to wonder if it was really necessary for her to try and get with every single one of his partners at least once. Then again, the main reason why the two had grown as close as they did over time was most likely that neither of them got angry over things like that. Well, that and some other reasons. Almost as if to confirm the notion, Admir sighed as he sat down on James's left side, while Coco already took up his right. You two will never change, will you? He asked, although his merry tone didn't quite support the annoyance that the statement itself would hint at. He ran a hand through his hair and quickly shifted around, making sure that his beloved jacket wasn't folded, crumpled, or wedged in anywhere before he fully settled down. You say that like you want us to, James mocked him as he began to strap in, looking at Admir's dark face with bemused fondness. There's still room for more if you want to join in, Coco joked additionally, taking her mockery into a very different direction from the one James chose. Admir rolled his eyes. I stayed true back then, and similarly, I will not make it any harder on James now, Admir said with resolve, hinting at the very same event James had thought about earlier, that was now long in all their pasts, although his voice wasn't quite hard enough to make it seem like he was truly criticizing Coco for her behavior. Coco shifted her lips and studied him for a second, before her eyes glided down from Admir and across James with a contemplative expression on her face. James knew what she was doing. She was judging how easily she could close the distance between the two of them, also climbing over James in the process, without making an absolute fool of himself. Ultimately, it seemed that she came to the decision of not easily enough, and she changed her approach. Jamie, would you give this over to Admir for me, please? She asked. And before James could even answer, or fully process the question for that matter, she reached out a hand and wrapped it around his head, pulling it down to her level with surprising strength while pressing a long, forceful smooth right onto his cheek. Only several seconds later, she finally pulled away from him again with a sweet sing-songy, "Thank you," and settled back into her seat, now also strapping in for the flight. James and Admir both glanced at each other from the corner of their eyes, judging their respective next moves. James lifted a single, question eyebrow. In return, Admir rolled his eyes again, but gave an almost unnoticeable but confirming nod towards himself. You heard the lady, James announced, after having gotten the go-ahead, and quickly leaned over to give Admir an albeit much less excessive smooch on the cheek as well. At that, Coco giggled, and Andre soon joined her with a chuckle of his own as he watched the scene unfold. To his right, a much more serious sigh came from a person who was very much more earnestly annoyed at the now three of them never changing, as Athena dropped her head against the backrest of the seat with a quiet oomph. Meanwhile, most of the people hailing from the other groups of soldiers bemusingly observed their technical superiors behaving like a bunch of goofballs in front of them, while Keown looked pretty embarrassed and sheepish, and tried his best to avoid staring. And Tuya was, of course, still on her phone. Sheeta's hands were firm on the controls of the ship as she watched space go by them through the frontal window. Her heart was beating strongly in her chest, but she remained cool. She had flown before. She knew she could do this. It was a good thing void fright wasn't really a problem for Miat, otherwise this would have been a rather short stint as a co-pilot for her. Still, even for the rather hardy-minded Miat, it was a bit of an odd adjustment to actually see close-by celestial bodies, as well as artificial satellites and other ships move around her at near impossible speeds as they crossed the void. The speed pressed her into her seat, and with each movement she could feel the power of the machine behind her. The ship's force was raw and unbridled when compared to those of the communal fleet, and Sheeta could only imagine the kind of maneuvers it would be able to do, without any mechanically smoothing restrictions in its way. An inexperienced pilot, especially one hailing from a lower gravity world, could most likely accidentally crush themselves with the thrust alone, not even mentioning turns. She began to wonder how much she would be able to handle when in control of such a beast of a spaceship. However, despite the brutal nature of their vessel, Emerald Krieger controlled it with leisure, her hands clutching the controls strongly but not stiffly, as she gently adjusted the course and speed, with her shielded eyes transfixed onto their destination. Sheeta had expected James's mother to want to talk to her while they were alone, to question her or try to push her into a new position, or maybe to try and get her to help the Admiral to get James to follow her idea of what they should be doing. But Krieger did none of that. Her communications were minimal, and only concerned Sheeta's duties as a co-pilot, giving her commands ever so often or hinting at slight mistakes she made with her controls. No personal matter slipped in, and the cockpit was quiet for the most part. Now the surface of a strikingly red, about standard-sized planet came closer to them at almost alarming speeds, with the image of the large, in places cleared domes on its surface growing clearer and clearer by the second. Mars, Earth's red brother. If the cockpit allowed for it, Sheeta could have lightly turned her head and spotted the blue giant somewhere off in the distance, but, locked in their descent, all she could see was the ground. The Admiral had gotten permission to land a while ago, and they were closing in on a smaller, separated version of the likely inhabited domes littering the planet's red surface. The walls towards the ground were made of thick steel, that was replaced by a clear material further up. Tempered glass or something similar, most likely, although the glass ceiling was still permeated by a grid of thick metal beams. And now that they came closer, a part of the dome started to move. There was no sound that could reach them through the void, of course, but Sheeta could only imagine the deafening noise that the enormous engines had to make as they moved the tons and tons of material out of the way, as the dome gradually slid open, making way for them to land. "Set thrusters 3 and 6 to 166, the Admiral commanded, while pulling her controls closer to her, and Sheeta quickly complied, turning a dial in between them until it showed the wanted angle. "Thrusters 3 and 6 are 166, she gave back, and a feeling of her stomach being gently pressed into her knees as the ship readjusted its position was already starting to spread. The dome seemingly started to move as they turned, although that was of course just a trick of perspective. Now they saw the wider plains of Mars, and of course the dark sky above. All stars were blocked out by the planet's reflecting light. "Thrusters 2, 3, 5 and 6 to 090, the Admiral already commanded again a few seconds later, and Sheeta immediately complied. 2, 3, 5 and 6 at 090, she gave back, admittedly wincing a bit as she had to resort to the numbers' actual names, since she struggled a bit with the exact code. Luckily, she wasn't on the comm line and only talking to the Admiral herself. By now they were taken by the planet's gravity, and didn't have to power their descent manually anymore. It was just important to set down slowly, and the thrusters effectively worked against the planet's pull as they slowly but surely neared the ground. The wide plains were replaced by the surroundings of the larger domes, and the dark sky was soon partially blocked out by the steel holding up the clear ceiling. Gently, the Admiral and Sheeta adjusted the thrust bit by bit, taking away more and more of their downwards acceleration until they came to a complete stop, hovering about a measure above the ground, and from where they just as gently took away power from the thrusters again, allowing the vessel to sink down gradually, ultimately touching down like a gentle kiss. Quietly, they still clearly felt through vibrations from the ground spreading all the way into their vessel, the dome above them began to close again, as they got ready to reinstate the atmosphere they would need to exit their vessel. "Tower, this is Victor Whiskey 588. We've touched down successfully and are awaiting your instructions," Admiral Krieger said, casually letting go of her controls and leaning back. It really was a good thing that Sheeta had started to learn English when she did. "Victor Whiskey 588, this is Sea Tower Mars 6. We're reinstating atmosphere and will clear you to leave once it's done," the human manning the control tower replied in a crisp voice. "Welcome home, Admiral." Admiral Krieger nodded to herself and cut the transmission again, as she leaned back slightly and began to wait. Briefly, she glanced over at Sheeta. "Nice flying, Sheeta," she commented, with an appreciative tilt of her head. Sheeta's ears twitched. "You too, ma'am," she replied, and nodded back at the Admiral, who laughed hoarsely at her demeanour. "Oh, please, you're dating my son," she said, seemingly briefly glancing over at the radio to see if she had really stopped transmitting. "As long as we're planetside, you can call me Sophia if you want." She'd have swallowed. Was this a test? After all, even said son tended to address her almost exclusively as ma'am or admiral. However, Admir hadn't earlier, now she remembered. And he had once been in her position. But did that really mean anything? He also knew both her and James way longer than Sheeta did. Sheeta began to mumble, but Admiral Krieger didn't even let her finish. "It's fine. You don't have to decide right now," she said, with a downwards wave of her hand, as she averted her gaze again and looked out the front window. "Just know that the option's open." Not long after, a hissing sound began to fill the air, not only indicating that gas was being pumped into the room, but also that there was already enough air around to even carry the sound to their ears. And soon enough, the radio came to life once more. "Atmosphere reinstated, Victor Whiskey 588, Tower said. "You're cleared to step out." The two women looked at each other for a second before wordlessly standing up. "Thank you, Tower," the Admiral quickly said through the radio, before they opened the door and left the cockpit. In the back, everyone had already gotten up and formed a grouped-up line to leave the craft in an orderly fashion. Although James had seemingly separated from all that and waited right next to the door, leaning against the wall just like his mother had done earlier. Seeing Sheeta, he merely shot up. "Great flying, treasure," he greeted her, slinging his arms around her waist and planting a kiss on her forehead, while his mother walked on past with a bemused eye roll. Sheeta endured the kiss and then briefly pressed her head against his chest while softly purring, which gained the two of them some looks from the less familiar soldiers that ranged from bashfully amused to slightly resentful. "Thank you," Sheeta whispered, before pushing herself away from James again. "How was your flight?" James glanced over his shoulder with an almost unreadable expression, as his lips shifted from smile to frown and back. "Interesting," he ultimately replied, before sputtering and shaking his head with his eyes shut tightly. Sheeta studied him bemusedly, before following his gaze to the other humans. Something had clearly been going on. Whatever it had been, she suddenly wondered if she would be treated to the same at any point in the future. Whatever it was. On the Admiral's command, the people standing in the front row now opened the back ramp of the craft, and fresh air immediately began to rush into the previously hermetically sealed chamber. Sheeta breathed in deeply through her nose. She could certainly smell the human influence here on Mars, but there was a lot more to it. Iron. A lot of iron. And a leafy scent. There had to be plants close by somewhere, brought by hand to this barren place. After travelling at super high gravity for so long, the almost standard gravity on the planet needed a bit of getting used to again. Another opportunity to realise just how much her muscles had strengthened in recent times. She looked around. The area was wide and open, and the ground was covered in a beige material that reminded of asphalt. The massive walls of steel forming the outer shell of the dome on ground level were of course all-encompassing, but the starlight shining in through the roof kept it from looking completely like a prison. That and the massive gate that led into a connecting tunnel to a much larger dome that could be seen towering above the one they were currently in through the ceiling. The arriving passengers slowly spread out over the open area, generally moving in the direction of the gate while splitting up into groups of familiarity, separating from the main body of the large travelling party, now that they were officially dismissed. Still, even while split into their own groups, they were all funneled through the same bottleneck as they walked through the connecting tunnel towards the main dome. Admittedly, Sheeta felt some excitement well up within her. So far it had mostly been held back by the professionality of sitting behind the controls of a ship again. But now that was teetering out, she realised more and more that this would be the first time she was visiting a human colony. A space fully controlled and occupied by humans that wasn't just one of their ships. And their home planet would follow soon after. She remembered her first run-in with strange humans. How James had approached her on the ship, earning himself the scars on his arms. How he had kept some others on the GCS from gaining themselves quite similar ones by intervening when they thoughtlessly went to touch her. About the first few soldiers she had run in after they had gotten separated. This place would be that times 1,000. She would have to be prepared for that. This wasn't a communal space where people would stare but ultimately try to avoid her. This wasn't Dunama, where everyone stuck to themselves unless they had a very good reason not to. These were humans. Curious, distractible, fearless, Many of them would approach her on a whim, even physically if they felt bold, and she had to be ready for that, if she didn't want to cause any incidents. She strained her eyes to see what was ahead, but the small exit of the tunnel only allowed her very limited insight. It didn't help that her eyes were much worse than those of a human. James was walking next to her, his face a picture of restrained expectation. He had of course been here before, often even. A trip to Mars probably wasn't anything special for him. Then again, it had been a long time. As they stepped out, Sheeda immediately looked around. The first thing she saw was buildings. Buildings upon buildings, stacked high on top of each other with many, many levels, hundreds of windows indicating an enormous number of rooms housed within each one. They had rigid forms, their corners were pointy, and their edges were hard and sharp, making them look more like boxes or crates than buildings. And there were just so many. It reminded her of the cramps, the way there was just level upon level, flat upon flat, building next to building, even if this entire area wasn't quite as cramped as the picture she had in mind. In fact, the buildings seemed to have been built either without a system, or with a system that she didn't quite get, because it didn't seem to her like they were forming any particular pattern, instead seemingly standing completely random in their placement, at least from her perspective. The tunnel they had walked through led onto a brownish walkway that immediately connected to a beige street made of the same material as the landing field behind them. The streets were filled with oddly shaped vehicles driving around in an orderly fashion, and shining in all sorts of different colours and variations. And, of course, there were people. Boy, were there ever people. Humans, thousands of them, walking around way too closely to each other like a bunch of insects skittering over their nest. Men, women, children, and whatever else one could think of were all moving tightly packed, with none of them seemed to have any problem with walking past strangers, while almost brushing shoulders. They were noisy, too, with their clacking boots and stomping feet, and loud voices chattering away vapidly. And yes, although a small part of her hadn't quite believed it, even up until now, they were indeed almost exclusively dressed in colourful yet flimsy fabrics, with the odd exception for some leather or plastic being made, but almost no metal in sight except for decorations. Even now, her brain told her that she had ended up somewhere in the lowest of the low parts of Mars, even though she obviously knew that not to be true. It was just a half feeling to shake, especially after spending time on Dunama again. The picture of the cramps was hard to scrub from her mind. As she slowly began to become overwhelmed by sheer sensory overload from all the colours, smells, and most importantly sounds around her, her attention suddenly snapped towards movement, coming towards them fast. She turned her head just in time to see the last few measures of Nia's running start, before the dark-skinned woman already slammed into her brother, forcing the larger man to compensate with a few steps backwards, while he let out a sharp oof. Although, despite the sound of pain and the stumbling steps, he almost immediately wrapped both arms around his sister tightly, and started to let out a laugh that sounded almost relieved in nature. Once he had his balance back, James lifted Nia off the ground, twirling her around in place for a moment while she loudly giggled, and her feet kicked away at the air wildly before they were set down to the ground once again. "Hey, Nia," James cooed deeply, and gently pushed her away from him just far enough so he could look into her face. His hands then wandered away from her shoulders and towards her face, as he cupped it in between them and leaned in to press a kiss onto her forehead. Just as he was done with that, Nia already swiped both his hands away so she would have a clear jump to hug him once more, if a little less forcefully this time. Her arms clamping shut around his neck and pulling their faces close together that way, she said, "Welcome home, James." Then, with a clearly artificial humming sound of strain, she pressed tighter for a second, swaying both of their bodies left to right briefly, before ultimately letting go of her brother with a quick and forceful release. James nodded at her, while his sister already took a small step back and turned her gaze to James's left, where the Admiral stood, watching the greeting with a quiet smile on her face, and Kamiana Kion by her side. Almost immediately, Nia approached the smaller woman. Her mother? Sheeda wasn't so sure about that one. And the Admiral returned it in kind, with the two of them embracing tightly for a moment, looking a lot more dignified in the process than the greeting that James had gotten. "Welcome home, Sophia," Nia said, in a much more controlled and refined, yet still clearly loving voice. "Hello, sweetie," Admiral Krieger replied, and repeated her son's earlier gesture by pressing a kiss onto Nia's forehead. "How nice of you to come pick us up." "Are you kidding?" Nia immediately replied, and slightly pushed back from the Admiral. I wouldn't miss you for the world. With that, she already made motions to continue her welcomes, by turning around to Keown, seemingly intending on greeting him next. However, at that moment, slender arms tightly wrapped around her from behind, squeezing her gently, while she was left to turn her head to see who exactly was grabbing her there. Hey, Nee! Coco rustled right into her rear, while clearly not letting herself be shaken, as Nia tried to turn towards her. Long time no see. Coco! Nia yelled out, her face lighting up with excitement as she seemingly recognized the voice, and she now tried even harder to actually get a look at the commander, although she was quite versed in clinging on to someone, it seemed. You're here too? It's been ages. And while she'd watched those two dealing with that, she was suddenly jolted back to attention by the sound of clacking metal on the ground. In all this noise, she hadn't noticed it so far, until it was basically right next to her, and now as she shot around, she came face to face with Curie. The cyborg stood perfectly still once their softly glowing red eyes met with Sheeda's. The black exterior of their metallic body was matte, but somewhat shiny, looking almost like it had recently been polished and maybe even waxed. They were holding themselves up with just 4 of their massive backwards legs, while the 2 remaining ones at the front were raised into the air, almost like open arms. Meanwhile, their puny forwards arms and legs had apparently been fiddling with each other before they had frozen like that. Hello, the cyborg's synthetic voice meekly said, after a few seconds of them holding eye contact with each other, although they still did not move the slightest bit even as they spoke. Hey, Sheeda replied hesitantly. Her eyes were locked onto Curie's face, but her brain was locked in an entirely different way, while it tried desperately to process something. Because currently, it was being flooded by endorphins. She didn't quite know why. She hadn't thought much about the cyborg while she and James were off on their own, so it wasn't exactly like she'd been spending any sleepless nights or anything like that. But now that she stood right in front of them again... Damn it. She had missed the cyborg. Curie! James loudly said, apparently having heard the exchange and now unknowingly coming to Sheeda's rescue in the inaction. Wow, it's good to see you. How have you been? Sheeda briefly looked over at her boyfriend as he stepped back to her side, after being tackled away by his sister earlier. He looked at Curie with the same elated excitement in his eyes that Sheeda's brain was trying to tell her she was feeling as well, although his gaze didn't linger on the cyborg for long, because it was soon pulled upwards by the movement of massive forms right behind them. A lot has happened, Curie replied vaguely, finally breaking out of their unmoving state as they moved slightly aside to allow James to look and move past them earlier. Yeah, you can say that again, James mumbled, walking past Curie. Though he briefly stopped, reaching his own cyborg appendage out and gently putting it on Curie's shoulder while looking directly at their face. The arm works great, by the way. Thank you so much. Curie shifted their body into an approximation of a nod, before James pulled his hand back and went on to greet the approaching giants. More! He yelled out, with his arms widely spread, and his head cranked all the way back into his neck. Damn, I forgot how big you were. He then moved to hug one of Moore's legs in greeting, which was basically the only part of her that he could easily reach. The massive old Raphaelite lady bent down to him, putting her large, free-clawed hands onto his back. She still wrapped herself in one of the large blankets that the humans of the Salem had originally gifted her when they were first detained on the vessel. Her long, fuzzy fur, that Sheeda still remembered as mostly unkempt and dishevelled, was instead combed and groomed almost all over, looking a lot silkier than in Sheeda's memory, and it had a certain shine to it. All over, it was once again woven into tiny braids, sometimes just because, sometimes holding something in the weave, like tiny artificial flowers or other decorations, that Sheeda didn't quite know what to make of. Even her 4 massive notched horns seemed to be primed and polished in a way. Oh, James, the old woman said, the labour of even having to bend down to him clearly audible in her voice. It is good to have you back in one piece. James scoffed. Really in one piece this time, he joked, looking up at her and presenting his mechanical prosthetic. A joke that the Raphaelite not only seemingly understood, but she also chuckled at it quietly without a single sign of discomfort at the robotic limb replacement. You're still not quite without conflict, it seems. A much deeper, much rougher voice joined into the conversation, accompanied by the sound of hard claws tapping on the hard floor, with the booming steps of 4 legs. Conglorch leered down at James with 2 of his fiery eyes, while the other 2 looked over at Sheeda, studying her intensively. Different from Moore, the massive Tonashtrasite had seemingly not made a habit of carrying around the humans' gifts that had been given to him in the past, displaying his naked armoured plates for all to see. And judging by their matte appearance, he also hadn't taken to taking better care of himself quite like the other two had. Still, the enormous lizard seemed to be quite jovial in his approach, despite the quite serious tone and subject of his comments. "The mere seems to be adorned by some new decorations," he finished his earlier thought, his eyes lingering on Sheeta's face, and especially her scars, for just a moment more, before they pulled away and started to look around the room attentively. His words also pulled Moore's attention onto her, and Sheeta could see the old lady's dark brown eyes widen slightly as they fell onto her face. "Oh no, Sheeta," she mumbled under her breath, standing back up to her full height and beginning to walk towards the feline. "Your face, oh you poor thing." Sheeta's ears twitched and her ears stood up straight in surprise at the Raphaelite's reaction. She sounded quite honestly concerned. And she wasn't a good actor, meaning that Sheeta was left with little but to believe that she really meant that. "It's okay, I'm fine," Sheeta said reassuringly, lifting both hands in a calming manner and taking a single step away from Moore to try and avoid her. However, she froze in the motion, her brain somehow not allowing her to flee from the interaction. Behind Moore, she briefly saw James pat one of Conglorch's massive maulers that formed his front feet, before his attention seemed to be pulled away by something else. Then, all she saw was fur. It was warm, even if Moore had trouble really getting her massive arms around Sheeta. The thick, heavy fur resting on her alone was enough to give her a warm, encompassing feeling. Sheeta just stood there, stunned for a moment, her brain completely blanking on how to react. She simply let it happen. Soon Moore pulled back again, though she remained down on her knees with her massive face lowered all the way to look at Sheeta closely. Her huge dark eyes gleamed wetly as she studied the thin remains of Sheeta's injuries that still ran across her face, so much so that the feline could also see them in her own reflection, looking back at her from Moore's pupils. "Your beautiful face," Moore repeated her earlier statement, and in a gesture that Sheeta had by now almost started to become familiar with, the old woman reached out one of her lanky arms and gently ran the smooth back of her large claw along Sheeta's cheek, following the course of the scars all the way down to her neck. Her body finally shaking out of its stupor and moving on its own, Sheeta reached up and grabbed the claw, holding it where it was while slightly pushing her face against it. She was shaking. Her hands, her head, everything, but she could also hear herself purring. "I'm fine," she repeated gently, her voice undercut by the gentle rumbling of her chest that filled the air. Her voice was just as shaky as her body. She remained like that for many breaths. She didn't count the seconds. She just concentrated on the feeling on her face. Then finally she let go and took a step back, allowing Moore to stand up again. I've missed you," she said. She'd wanted to say it loudly, however her voice failed her as she admitted this to herself as much to the world, making it come out as barely more than a whisper. She hadn't felt it before. It hadn't even occurred to her, in fact. But now that she was standing in front of Moore, it was undeniably true. She then turned her head towards Curie, who had fallen back a bit to give more room for her embrace, but was still standing close by. "And you too, Curie. I've missed you all." The cyborgs started to awkwardly rub their forward hands together, while Moore looked down at her, seeming almost as shock-stunned as Sheeta had been earlier. Sheeta used the opportunity to look up at Conglorch. He glanced back at her, tilting his head in appreciation, although his demeanour still clearly showed that he would not be joining in on any sappiness right now. "Oh, I've missed you too, Sheeta," Moore finally announced, breaking out of her surprise and wiping away at her eyes with a corner of the blanket she wore over her back. "I'm glad you're back," Curie agreed softly. "I don't mind the scars." Sheeta smiled and nodded gently, looking at the two of them, before glancing around for a second. She wondered how James was reacting to all of this. After all, he had been on their case about getting along a lot. However, at her first glance she couldn't find him. It seemed he wasn't anywhere nearby, and so she looked around a bit more attentively, trying to make out the shape of her boyfriend anywhere in the crowd. A large waving hand suddenly got her attention, as Conglorch gestured in the direction of the dome's wall somewhere behind them. She turned to follow the gesture with her eyes, and after a moment of searching she finally found him. James stood hunched, his head hanging deeply, the palms of his hands covering his eyes, while he pushed hair out of his face with his fingers. He looked distraught. And in front of him stood a pale yet clearly suntanned man. He was smaller than James, and he looked old, his black hair having long begun to grey. The hair was unkempt, and a grey beard was growing out of the man's face in wild, uneven stubble. However, his face was gentle and kind, as he placed both hands on James's shoulder, making James look up at him. And wordlessly, the man then pulled him into a hug.